All right, let's dive into a really critical turning point in Indian history, the arrival of the Europeans and eventually the rise of British power. Now, to really get this, we can't just start with the Mughals. We have to go way back to the 15th century, to figure out why Europeans were so obsessed with finding a way to India in the first place.
So that leads us to the big question, right? For centuries, since the ancient Greeks and Romans, there were trade links between Europe and India over land. But by the 1400s, that direct connection was pretty much gone. So what changed? Why on earth did these European nations decide to risk everything on these incredibly dangerous sea voyages? Answering that is the key to understanding all the rest.
So here's our game plan. First, we'll look at why they even needed a new sea route. Then we'll get into the Portuguese, who were the first to show up and really dominate. After that, we'll see how the Dutch and the English came in to challenge them, which all leads to the incredibly important Carnatic Wars. And finally, we'll wrap up by figuring out just why it was the English who came out on top.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning, the desperate search for a direct sea route to India. And this wasn't just some grand adventure, This was born out of some serious economic and political pressure.
You see, after the Roman Empire fell, the whole trade map just got completely redrawn. Arab merchants basically took over the key trade routes through places like Egypt and Persia. And just like that, Europe's direct pipeline to India was severed. For hundreds of years, if you wanted those amazing Eastern goods, spices, silks, cottons, they had to go through these powerful middlemen. Now, what's really fascinating here is how it was a total chain reaction. The first domino to fall was in 1453, when the Ottoman Turks conquered Constantinople. This basically cemented Muslim control over all the major pathways between Europe and Asia. The Arab merchants had a complete monopoly, and because of that, the prices for Indian goods back in Europe just went through the roof. The economic pressure was intense, and it created this incredibly powerful motivation for Europeans to find a way around them, a direct sea route. But here's the thing, it wasn't just about the money. The 15th century was this perfect storm of change in Europe. You had the Renaissance, which sparked this whole new spirit of adventure and curiosity. Technology was catching up, too, with huge advances in shipbuilding and navigation. Plus, economies were growing, meaning more people wanted all those luxury goods. And on top of all that, for countries like Portugal and Spain, this was also a religious and political mission, which added a whole other layer of motivation. So, who was the first to take on this massive challenge? Well, that would be the Portuguese. They were the trailblazers. They found the sea route, and believe me, their goals shifted really fast, from just trading to wanting to rule the entire ocean. This timeline just shows you their relentless drive. It all kicked off with Prince Henry the Navigator. Then, in 1487, a huge breakthrough. Bartholomew Diaz makes it around the Cape of Good Hope. A few years after that, you get the Treaty of Tordesillas, which is just mind-blowing. Portugal and Spain literally sat down and divided the entire non-Christian world between them. That treaty basically gave Portugal the green light for everything in the East, and with that, just 4 years later, Vasco da Gama went and finished the job. So picture this, May 1498. Vasco da Gama, with his 3 ships, finally lands in Calicut, guided by a Gujarati pilot named Abdul Majid. This one event changed everything for the subcontinent. The local Hindu ruler, the Zamarin, was actually pretty welcoming. The Arab traders already there? Not so much. Da Gama stayed for about 3 months, and when he got back to Portugal, the profit from the goods he brought back was just enormous. It proved, beyond any doubt, how valuable this direct route was. So how did the Portuguese hang on to this incredible advantage? Well, their first governor, Francisco de Almeida, had this absolutely brilliant strategy called the Blue Water Policy. He figured, why bother conquering huge chunks of land? That's expensive and difficult. All we need to do is control the sea. He wanted to make Portugal the undisputed master of the Indian Ocean, forcing every other ship to buy a permit, a cartaz, from them just to be able to trade. It was all about building a maritime empire, not a land-based one. Now, while Almeida laid the foundation, the guy who's really seen as the true founder of Portuguese power was his successor, Afonso de Albuquerque. He took things to a whole new level. He set up strategic bases to control all the entrances to the Indian Ocean, at Ormuz, Malacca, you name it. But his biggest move? Capturing Goa from the Sultan of Bijapur in 1510. That was the first piece of Indian land under European control since Alexander the Great. He even had social policies, encouraging his men to marry local women to create a permanent Portuguese population and banning the practice of sati in his territories. This timeline really gives you the whole story in a nutshell. You see the big moments, Da Gama arriving in 98, Albuquerque taking Goa in 1510, which later becomes their capital. But you also see the other side of the story, the decline. By the mid-1600s, they're losing key ports to the Dutch and the English. Their century in the sun was coming to an end.
You know, a monopoly built on force just can't last forever. The profits were simply too gigantic for other European countries to just sit back and watch. And as the Portuguese started to lose their edge, new players entered the game. Players who were better organized, better funded, and ready to fight for their piece of the pie. I'm talking about the Dutch and the English.
Now, this slide is really important because it shows a crucial difference in strategy. The Dutch, they were obsessed with the Spice Islands in Indonesia. That's where the real money was for them. India was kind of secondary. The English, on the other hand, were laser-focused on India from day one. This different focus meant that while they clashed, the Dutch eventually decided it wasn't worth fighting hard in India when their Indonesian profits were so much bigger. That left a power vacuum that the English were more than happy to fill. A massive turning point for the English came in 1717. They got this imperial order, or farman, from the Mughal Emperor Farrukh Siyar. People call it the Magna Carta of the company, and for good reason. It basically gave them the right to trade duty-free in Bengal for a tiny annual fee. This was a huge commercial advantage over everyone else, and a major step on their path from traders to rulers. Okay, so with the Portuguese fading and the Dutch focused elsewhere, this stage was set for the final showdown. The fight for India came down to a bitter, knockdown, drag-out fight between the last two big European powers standing, the English and the French. And this battle for supremacy played out mostly in the Carnatic region of South India. If you want to understand why the English won, you just have to look at this table. The English East India Company was a private business. It was agile, it was hungry for profit, it could make decisions quickly. The French company? It was a state-run department, tangled up in bureaucracy and slow to react. Throw in the fact that the English had a much better navy and three of the most strategic ports, and you can see the writing was already on the wall. Their rivalry exploded into three separate wars. The first one was basically a spillover from a war in Europe, but the Battle of St. Thame was a real wake-up call. It showed that a small, well-disciplined European army could crush a much larger Indian force. That changed everything. The second war was all about both sides picking favorites in local power struggles, a tactic the French governor Dupleix was a master at. But it was the English officer Robert Clive and his daring siege of Arcot that really turned the tables. The third war was the final act, and it ended with a crushing, decisive English victory. So, this brings us to the big finale. Why the English? What was their winning formula? Let's break down exactly what allowed them to beat out every single one of their European rivals. You know, their success wasn't down to any single thing. It was this powerful combination of factors. They had the best navy, which meant they controlled the seas. The Industrial Revolution was kicking off back home, giving them an economic and tech advantage. Their government was stable, while France was, well, heading for a revolution. They had better military leaders, more money, and crucially, they were more focused on business than on converting people, unlike the early Portuguese. That made them seem less threatening, at least at first. And this quote from the source material, I think, really just hits the nail on the head. The very structure of the English company, the fact that it was a private business, gave it an edge. It created a culture of enthusiasm, of self-reliance. The French company, being a government project, was just sluggish. And that fundamental difference might have been the most important factor of all. If you have to point to one single moment where the game was won, this is it. The year is 1760, the Battle of Juan de Wash. This victory completely annihilated the French forces. It basically vaporized any hope the French had of a political future in India and left the English East India Company as the last European power standing. The road to empire was now wide open. And that leaves us with one final big question to chew on. When you look at this whole story, from a simple search for spices to the creation of a massive empire, you have to wonder, was the British conquest of India just an accident? A side effect of their business dealings that spiraled out of control? Or was it a deliberate, calculated plan from the very start? That's something historians still debate, and it's definitely something to think about.